Hello, Elsa. Hello, Rhoda.
Hello,
Simon.
Sam. Hello, colleagues.
Hey, Sam.
Hi, Philip. Prof. Robinson. Welcome to Auxin. We will start in a minute. Hey, welcome, colleagues. My name is Ngongile Ntwasa. I'm an advisor here at the Center for Teaching and Learning. Welcome to our second Auxin of the year. I'm going to hand over to Nicolene, our director in the center, to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much, Sam. Yes, it is my absolute privilege this afternoon to introduce this presenter of our session on criticality and social justice, Professor Chrissie Boughey. Professor Boughey has spent many years working in teaching and learning in higher education from a critical perspective aimed at promoting social justice, and she did this around the world. In South Africa, she worked at UWC, the University of Zululand, and most recently at Rhodes University, where she retired as Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Academic and Student Affairs. Over the years, Professor Boughey has been involved in a number of national initiatives directed at the assurance of quality and the improvement of teaching and learning in higher education. She supervises widely at doctoral level, and in 2005 was awarded a fellowship by the South African Association for Research and Development in Higher Education because of her work in academic development. All her published work draws on critical social theory, as do the many doctoral students she has supervised. With colleague Sioux McKenna, she is the author of the book Understanding Higher Education, Alternative Perspectives, published by African Minds, which provides an analysis of teaching and learning in higher education since the late 1980s, using critical social theory. This book is also listed as the recommended reading for today's session, and I have a copy with me here and would like to read two of the reviewers' comments about the book. Firstly, Professor Paul Ashwin from Lancaster University in the UK, who was our keynote speaker at last year's SOTL conference, and he said, "This important book offers a theoretically rich and engaging account of what is needed to ensure that university education is meaningfully accessible to all students. It offers a systematic view of the challenges facing teaching and learning in higher education and the potential for positive change." And then secondly, Dr. Langutani Masehela from the University of Venda, who said this book offers a critical stance with which all higher education practitioners should engage, given the rapid social and economic changes taking place the world over. Everyone concerned about universities and their role in society should read this book. Chrissie, thank you very much for joining us today as our speaker, and we are looking forward to listening to you. You are on mute.
Here we go. Thank you very much, Nicolene. And thank you to colleagues at the Centre for Teaching and Learning for inviting me to do today's session. I'm going to share my screen again and get back to my PowerPoint presentation. There we go. So yes, I'm going to talk on criticality and social justice, but I'm going to begin with a sort of bit of autobiography to explain how I got here, how I got to the position I now occupy. So I've described myself often as a woman in search for theory for many years of my life. I didn't consciously know I was in search for theory. I just know I was unsettled by the work I was doing. So my early career was spent in the Middle East, in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Yemen. I ended that part of my career with 4 years at the University of Sana'a in what was then the Yemen Arab Republic. Obviously a very, very troubled place it was then, and it continues to be now. I was working for the British Council and I was teaching English as a foreign language. I had a specialist qualification in English as a foreign language teaching from a British university. So I was supposedly well trained for the work I was doing. I also had a master's degree from another British university in English literature. And in all my work, I drew on what were called the best methods in language teaching, the most up-to-date methods, things that I've been taught to do. But throughout my time in the Middle East, I was haunted by a question. The question of, why doesn't this work? It's supposed to work, but it doesn't work. And towards the end of the time that I was in the Middle East, I ended up enrolling for a second master's degree in linguistics, again at a British university, University of Reading, to try to understand. This is where I was a woman in search for theory. In the 1980s, I joined a British Council-funded project at the University of the Western Cape. So that was my reason for coming to South Africa. I came on this British Council-funded project. And the University of the Western Cape, at that point in its history, was known as the intellectual home of the left. And it was such a rich space intellectually. And it offered numerous opportunities for me to go to seminars and other academic events. And I was absolutely enthralled by this whole new intellectual atmosphere that I found myself in. And as a result of that time at UWC, I encountered critical social theory. What I came to understand over time, and I ended up doing a PhD, something that in my previous work I hadn't really thought of doing, but I came to understand that we're all disciplined by our backgrounds, by our previous histories, including the disciplines in which we've been trained to understand things in particular ways. So my background, which was by that time in English literature and linguistics, led me to understand the so-called language problem from a perspective in theory in those areas. So I was drawing on English literature and linguistics to understand the so-called language problem. The project at UWC was focused on language. And I met students who, in the Middle East, I'd had students who, if I was handing back work and I'd ask them, what's your name? They couldn't answer me. When I was at UWC, I had students who came to me and they said, do you know, I have a language problem. And they could then proceed to discuss that so-called problem in English in intricate detail. So the students were very different, but they were all being named as having this language problem. But what happened was that my encounters with critical social theory offered me another perspective, if you like, a pair of theoretical spectacles at which I could look at this so-called language problem. And once I started wearing those spectacles, and all theory acts like that, it really is like a pair of glasses. You look through the glasses and you can see things that you didn't see before, or you see things differently. So once I'd started using this critical theory, once at least I had it. I didn't have it completely, but I had it and I was excited by it. Once I was looking through those theoretical spectacles, I started to see things very differently. So what did I begin to see? Well, first of all, I saw that the language problem involved more than grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And all the approaches I'd been taught to use involved the teaching of the mechanics of the language, the grammar particularly, the vocabulary, the lexis of the language. What I saw as a result of my reading and thinking and talking to students and so on was that students' experiences with language at university were related to their backgrounds and their histories of language use. And I put some publications there. I got those publications out of my PhD. 2005 one was a kind of afterthought, but I got those. But I saw in that PhD quite clearly, that study, that the background of the students, how they'd use language before they entered a university, was critical in seeing what they could do once they were in the university. So I came to the conclusion that teaching had to be much more complex than simply teaching what the literature will often call the surface features of the language. Teaching grammar is easy. It's boring, but it's easy. Teaching was much more complex than that, because it had to provide what Morrow, and Wally Morrow was at UWC when I was there, and I can remember him giving a seminar in the Academic Development Centre seminar series. That was his 1993 publication, where he spoke about epistemological access. So he made the distinction between admitting students to a university, giving them formal access, allowing them to register, and then giving them access to the forms of knowledge and ways of knowing that underpin the academy. And that thought, for me, became really central. So students' backgrounds, the language histories, if you like, would give them more epistemological access or less epistemological access. I began to see that very, very clearly. But Morrow's construct of epistemological access started to move me out of a narrow focus on language into looking at teaching and learning in higher education more generally. The more social theory I read, the more I came to understand that education works as a structure, a mechanism to distribute access to the goods of the world. So if you think about a degree, if you've got a degree, your chances of getting a job increase enormously. Your chances of earning more money increase. Your chances of being able to use that money to buy yourself a house, a car, and all those things increase enormously. So getting that degree and the path to that degree, educational path to that degree, it's going to work as a mechanism to give you access to the goods of the world. I got that, and then I also came to see that education worked not to widen or redistribute access but to maintain current social structures. And in the bullet there, you can see what I think is quite an astonishing observation, and that is that global data shows that the factor most likely to impact on the ability of young people to access and succeed in higher education. So they are the children, I haven't phrased that very well, they are the children of middle-class educated caregivers. So those who are most likely to get in and succeed have had somebody in their house who's had an education. The more education there is in the home, the better their chances. There's a slew of research that will support that. I've just put some of it in that in as references there. But we don't really have a means of checking students' backgrounds. When I was at Rhodes University, I changed our admissions form. I got that changed so that we could try to get more insight into the home of origin and the levels of education in the home of origin. You can often see it if you look at the occupations of the caregivers, but sometimes it just has to be somebody who happens to come into that home or be influential in that home, or it can be through all sorts of other means as well, but I won't go into them now. But basically, if you encounter any kind of educated discourse, what I learned to call elevated discourse, ways of thinking about knowledge, knowing, and so on, then your chances of getting in and succeeding in higher education improve enormously. And as I started to get this, the more I wanted my teaching and research to challenge the way education, and particularly higher education, worked. If you look at South African data, the VitalStats, you can't disaggregate the home from those vital stats. But if you start to overlay, and now you can begin to do that with some complex scrutiny of tables in the vital stats, if you start to overlay NSFAS on the data for throughput and graduation rates, you can start to see that in South Africa. You can start to see that the students who are coming from poor backgrounds, whose families historically have been denied access to any form of quality education, you can start to see that they're the students who are giving us our appalling performance data. Performance data which shows that regardless of the university, regardless of the qualification, and regardless of the field of study, Black students fare less well than white students. So I started to see the reason for this in the way education favours those who come from an educated background. And over time, it wasn't, there were, of course, flashes of insight, but over time, I came to understand explanations of success as falling along a continuum. And this came out of a big piece of work that I did, a commissioned research for the Council on Higher Education, where I was asked to explore the impact of the first cycle of institutional audits on teaching and learning. And I was given all the data, all the audit data from that first cycle by the CHE. It was written up for the CHE in 4 reports. I wrote 3 reports. Sioux McKenna wrote 1. And then we together published on this. But this continuum came out of that original research. So you can see that what the continuum involves is a movement from what we called the model of the student as a decontextualized learner to the model of the student of a social being. And basically, to explain a little bit, models are theories, both formal theories and informal theories. We have about students, teaching, learning, and so on. And these theories lead to the emergence of teaching practices, things we do in order to teach. They'll also lead to executive decisions about where to spend, for example, university capacity development grant, and so on and so on. And by far, this model, the model of the student of the decontextualized learner, it dominates. It's everywhere. Absolutely dominates. This one, it's hard to argue. People don't get it. But I'd argue that it's our only chance, if picking up on this, it's our only chance of really making higher education a more socially just space, particularly in South Africa. So let me just run through those two broad ends of the continuum, very blunt. So this model of the student as a decontextualized learner, it doesn't distinguish between types of knowledge. It just says knowledge is knowledge is knowledge. Okay, and it's the same with learning. It views learning as unitary, one thing. And it argues that learning and knowledge acquisition are open to anyone, provided they have the right attributes. In our writing, Sue and I call them characteristics inherent to the individual. And typically these are things like intelligence, motivation, aptitude. So in that CHE data, people were asked to explain why their performance data was poor. And they'd say things, well, you know, a lot of students aren't cut out for university study, or students don't work hard. There you go, motivation and aptitude came out very clearly. So what this model does is it allows you to attribute failure to a lack of these attributes. So the blame goes firmly onto the student and the institution is absolved. In contrast, the student as a social being, the model of the student as a social being, says there are many different forms of knowledge. I put two references there, Bernstein, Gamble, Colmayton more latterly. They are all people who've identified these forms of knowledge. And similarly, there are many different ways of knowing. And higher education, I should have put in there, favours particular forms of knowledge and particular ways of knowing. It dismisses others. And learners are acquainted with different forms of knowledge and ways of knowing from birth, literally from birth. And there's a whole lot of ethnographic research which can show how this happens. And some students, typically though from homes with educated caregivers, have been introduced to forms of knowledge and ways of knowing privileged by the university from birth. And this then gives them a head start. And when I started to get that, I could look at the things. I have two sons. I could start to see the things that had happened in their home, which had privileged them, which gave them a head start. Now, if you start to get this stuff, if you start to work from a perspective in social justice, I bet you'll need to let go of long cherished beliefs. When I was doing my PhD, my supervisor said to me, you do realize, don't you, you're biting the hand that fed you? Because I turned and I was very, very critical of the work I'd been doing for many years. And yeah, I was, and it was very uncomfortable doing that. But uncovering the beliefs I held and seeing what was wrong with them, a process that involved reflection, was enormously rewarding for me in the long run. But I've given some of the long cherished beliefs that I think you might have to question. One is that schools prepare learners for university. I'll explain that a bit. That academic support services, and that's where I worked for years, can remedy deficits. And the other one is good teaching is about getting the message across. Let me just briefly speak to them. Do schools really prepare for higher education? Well, if you look at, for example, Bernstein, he explains how the knowledge taught at school differs from that taught at university. The knowledge is produced in the universities, it's then selected by the people in charge of curricula, and then it's presented in classrooms where it takes a different form. And Maton, his legitimation code theory, that's also allowed us nowadays to produce quite sophisticated explanations of those different forms. And then there's the book by Geisler, Cheryl Geisler, who offers a wealth of evidence to show how reading and writing differ at school and university. So you have to start asking, to what extent are schools really preparing learners for higher education? I could tell you some anecdotes about my children where I had to step in and teach my children to do stuff at school, which I knew they would need to forget once they got to higher education. If anybody's ever interested, I'm happy to talk about that. Then we come to academic support, academic development, where I worked for many years. Once you start looking and using critical social theory, and particularly the work on knowledge and knowing, you see that learning and writing, they're discipline specific. It depends in which discipline you are located. I can't write in science. I can write in a very narrow area, which I'd called higher education studies. I can't even write those broad, what could I call them? Sort of discursive pieces that are common in many social sciences disciplines. I can't do that. Yet, I'm supposed to be a specialist in language if you look at my qualifications. Activities in the disciplines are governed by sets of rules related to what can count as knowledge and how it can be known. That's where you get your different orientations, positions on research. And they ultimately will come to generate the practices that we use to know. And so the question is, can generalists in academic support services teach those rules? And what they often do is they teach a set of generic skills. But I don't think that being successful at university is about acquiring skills. I think it's about developing a different knower identity. It's about becoming a different kind of knower, a different person. And that requires profound shifts of an individual, of some more than others, needless to say. So working from a perspective in social justice requires academic teachers to understand how their beliefs and the practices that give rise, that emerge from those beliefs, can lead to exclusion, both formal exclusion, there you go, you're excluded now, and exclusion from the ways of knowing key to success. A student can pass, but they still don't have epistemological access. They can float around the 50% mark. They can piece together a degree, but they're still not really in control of the ways of knowing that are favoured in the university. So the final thing I think that you need to consider is about, is teaching about disseminating knowledge? Is it about getting the message across? I don't think it is. I think it's about modelling knowledge making. And I'm going to spend the last few minutes, I've got 5, I think, talking about this. So let me begin with the humanities and the social sciences. Typically, students are provided with a reference list, and they're expected to read and refer to the articles, books, and their assignments. And often we tell them, I will expect you to refer to these 3 articles, something like that. And many of the students respond in a sort of show and tell or cut and paste fashion. Some of them literally cut and paste, and some of them will go beyond the articles that we've suggested they read and go to the internet and cut and paste. In acts of what I'd call knowledge telling. They think their role is to tell us the knowledge, to tell us. And I often used to say to students, whenever I spoke to them, you know, I already know this stuff, so why are you retelling me? So this leads to the question of what would happen if they were taught that any piece of writing consists of a series of knowledge claims. Any piece of writing or any piece of academic speaking, for that matter, a lecture, a seminar, or whatever, it's a series of knowledge claims. And a knowledge claim is a statement that the speaker or the writer believes to be true, believes to be the case. But importantly, each knowledge claim has to be supported by evidence. And in the undergraduate years, certainly in the humanities and social sciences, the evidence typically comes from the literature. That's what referencing is. The referencing is the evidence for the claim a writer wants to make. What would happen if we taught referencing as that, and not as avoiding plagiarism or as a set of technicalities? What if we tried to get across to students, your job is to make sense of this stuff and make these things called knowledge claims, but you've got to have the evidence for them, and the evidence will come from the literature. What if, through talking to them, they were guided to adopt a reader position that required them to use the literature as evidence for the claims they wanted to make? And what if this was a widespread approach across the faculty? What if somehow you could introduce it at the beginning of a new year, and if different teachers in different departments picked up on it across an entire faculty? Could that not be something? Could that not be a movement towards shifting the identities of students and giving them this epistemological access and empowering them as knowers? If we shift now to other disciplinary areas, those with practicals, and what happens in a practical is that students often follow a recipe book approach. So they've got this list of instructions. I've come to this incidentally. If I go back to that one, I talked to academics. I analysed the assignments to get to this position. Okay. And then I went back and I checked with, this was at Rhodes, I checked with the academics and I said, is it right that this is what you actually want students to do? That you want them to make knowledge claims and back them up with evidence? And once I'd explained what that meant, nobody I talked to said no. They all said, you know, I never thought of it like that, but they agreed. I did the same thing in the natural sciences. We don't have engineering or medicine at Rhodes, but they do the practicals. They've got this recipe book approach, and I stood in practicals and watched students following the recipe. But they have to write a prac report detailing what they did. And typically, the last section of the report requires them to report on findings or implications. And a lot of students scored very badly on that last section of the report. But what if they were guided to understand that in this section, they needed to make knowledge claims, that they needed to use the data, the measurements and observations from the practical to support their claims. And they also needed to draw on the theory that they'd been taught in the lectures. Okay? And again, what if that approach was widespread across the faculties? So I had a go at trying to make it widespread at Rhodes. I actually wrote an introductory guide for students called Are You Learning?, which we distributed. We even produced a drama on it. So I had a real attempt to get this going in the faculties. So that was in my time there. You know, what I have learned in academic development, if you're not there and you keep pushing, then things slip away. So yeah, I don't really know what's happening now because I had to walk away. But I came to this very different approach and very different understanding through my own introspection and through being critical and having to overturn my own ideas that I'd relied on as a teacher of language and more latterly in my career as someone working in academic development. So there are the references. You'll get them because you'll get the presentation eventually. So Sim or Nicoline, back to you.
Thank you, Chrissie. Thank you so much for sharing with us this very important journey of yours and how you, through reflection, overturned your own ideas, because I think that's something that we sometimes don't want to engage in. But you showed us how this really leads to lifelong learning. So thank you so much. If there's any questions from the audience, please put up your hand or post it in the chat. I saw some comments there from Jean. She is joining us from Norway. Welcome, Jean. And she said then that students are less prepared for the current and future expectations of the social justice awareness required beyond higher education, especially if they're going to grow economic and social security in South Africa. And then she asked the question, how can students access the kinds of knowledges needed when we reach so few lecturers with the necessary interactions? And then she obviously commented on your slide that I also thought was really, really useful and made me so, think deeply about what we do. So I don't know whether you would like to respond to any of those comments. Jean, unfortunately, she said she cannot speak from Norway, so she can only type. So I don't know if you want to respond to any of those at this stage, Chrissie?
Yeah, Jean, all I can say is you've got to keep at it. Talk to people, keep mentioning the same ideas, be consistent, and don't give up. Yeah, I didn't crack it, but you know, you've got to keep at it. It's hard work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chrissie. Any other questions, comments from the floor? You're welcome to put up your hand or type. Chrissie, I've got a question. You said our only chance in South Africa is to change our views about the decontextualized learner, the view that's held in most places. Do you have any suggestions as to how we could go about that?
You know, it's so ingrained. I've done a lot of work as well in sort of theorizing the theory by trying to explore, you know, why those theories are so strong. I think they're discourses, they're sets of ideas that clump together in language, and they're all around us. They're absolutely everywhere. And the point is that you have to become aware of these ideas that exist in language, because if you're not aware, then you just slip into using them. I had a vice chancellor who was one of the most critical people I knew, who was also had enormous concerns for social justice. But he would sometimes say to me, Chrissie, have you got any smart students? I want them to do this, that, and the other. He wanted them actually to give them work. And I used to say to him, what do you mean by smart? Do you realize what you're saying? What you're asking me? So if you can get those ideas about smartness, what actually do you mean by being smart? Is it intelligence? Is it motivation? What is it? And that you keep challenging it. I mean, that's what I do all the time now. I challenge it. I think as researchers, I'm particularly hard as a supervisor on my students. We talk a lot about the model of the student as a social being. In our doctoral program, we draw on that. And so through that, we've been able to spread that wider into other universities. So yeah, it's really, really hard to dislodge that model. It is everywhere. Read the newspaper, watch the television, it's everywhere. Yeah, you can only challenge it.
And then what I also understood is then through being critically reflective about our own practices and getting to our own theories, and realize that we're actually focusing on this decontextualized learner. And it's almost, yeah, only once you've uncovered your own thoughts and beliefs, then you can start working on them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Academic development, teaching and learning college, they'll often talk about reflexivity, and that can be painful.
Yeah.
When you realize, oh my goodness, so that's what I'm thinking. That can be very upsetting, uncomfortable.
Yeah. Before I ask something else, I don't know whether there's anybody who would like to comment or ask.
In the chats, we have Simon and Prof. Robinson. So Simon is asking, is the success of students from middle class education homes because of them learning about making knowledge claims at home?
Sorry, where is it? I'm looking at the chat.
It's if you go up, so 1, 2, 3, 4 from the bottom on the chat from Simon.
Low, is that?
Yes.
The success of students from middle class education homes because of them learning about making knowledge claims. I think that's part of it. I mean, I think that, you know, the way, even if we're not talking directly to our children, they are exposed to conversations where we'll make a statement, we'll always back it up with evidence. But that, you know, in the literature, there's evidence too of that happening in all sorts of ways that are unexpected. There's a paper by Arona Dyson in one of those early AD publications, and she was collecting what are called literacy histories. So she was asking students about their histories of learning to read. And this young man was brought up in the rural Transkei by his grandmother, who happened, she's bedridden, but she had these children. She looked after the children. She was a very religious woman, and she sent the children to church every Sunday. She insisted they went to church. But what was different is that because she couldn't go to church, when the children got home, they had to tell her what the pastor had said. Now, how's that for listening to a lecture? They had to listen because Granny was going to interrogate them. But the best bit was she then proceeded to argue with the pastor and tell the students, that this young man, the children, why the pastor was wrong, because she knew her Bible. And so she was taking issue with the pastor. So if you like, she was giving those children permission to disbelieve, permission to contest a dominant position. And that was in a very poor home in the Transkei. So it comes in all sorts of strange ways. But yes, we are exposing our children to the ways of knowing, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously from birth.
Thank you. Sorry that I've missed the questions. My teams was frozen, but I think then Maureen Robinson. Can you see the question, Chrissie?
I can.
Okay, if you.
So do you think it's useful to make a distinction between gaining skills and developing a learner identity? Yeah, I'm always wary of the term skill. I think skills are sets of practices, things that we do when we read, for example, a text. And I think, you know, we talk about critical reading and writing. Well, what do we do? Well, I think we bring our knowledge of the world, everything we've learned so far, and we bring our knowledge of other texts to the reading of that text. And we balance the two. So that's where the criticality comes in. Is that a skill? Is it a disposition? Is it that somewhere along the way you've had the permission to disbelieve? I know how I got the ability to disbelieve, and it was listening to my father arguing with the newspaper every day. But yeah, it's about, it's more than just a skill. You know, often people will teach reading skills, SQ3R, whatever it is. But I think it's about how you understand yourself as a person. So your writing skills, it's, I understand myself as someone who knows. I understand myself as someone who's going to make my own claims, state my own views, but those views are knowledge claims, statements about what I believe to be true. But I've got to find the evidence for those claims. And where's the evidence come from? I think it's about change at a much more profound level than teaching these simple skills, which sadly people in academic support programs often do. So yeah, Maureen, I do think it's useful to make that distinction between skills and identity, and to see the things we do as practices which emerge from a position. Shall I go down?
Yes, Chrissie, I see there's another question from Alison. Alison is in academic planning and quality assurance. So there she's asking the link or the use of critical social theory in evaluation of teaching and learning.
Well, it comes back to that reflexivity I was talking about. I mean, I wrote about this in a piece that the CHE published. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. It's in their, what do they call it? Briefly speaking. It's on evaluation as a form of research. You can find that on the CHE website. I think that we often conduct evaluations in a very unresearcher-like way. So we get students to fill in questionnaires, surveys, or we get them to answer open-ended questions. And okay, that's one perspective, but we need to bring in other lenses to look at whatever we're looking at, whether it's the course or the assessment or whatever. I mean, do you bring in the student data? Are you looking at who failed? Not just your overall pass rate, but who are the students who failed? Where did they come from? What kind of schools did they come from? That's where you get their background coming through. Do you know anything about their families, where they live, and so on and so on? And then that's got to make a difference. You've got to think about it and say, whoa, am I reaching the whole class, or am I only reaching the privileged few? So I think that idea of reflexivity and using a whole source of data, not only what students say in questionnaires or open-ended questions, but looking hard at your performance data and asking who exactly have passed, where have they passed, who are the high flyers, who are the people clustered around the 50% mark, and then saying, well, why? I think that's about using that critical social theory.
Thank you, Chrissie. I see we have a hand. Yes, Professor Naidu, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Chrissie. It was really, really so well aligned to what we are trying to do. So I'm in engineering, and exactly what you just mentioned. So in engineering, we have to look at exit level outcomes and graduate attributes. And when you look at the entrance of new learners, some of them in particular in terms of presentation and oral communication skills, some learners have had the advantage of, attending speech classes and drama, etc. And yet we put everybody on the same level in terms of assessments. So there needs to be different mechanisms to, as you said, give others the opportunities to catch up and to provide that support, rather than just assessing for the sake of assessing. Learning, there needs to be a bigger focus on learning. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're working with the Drama and Language Center in providing that support to learners. at second year and third year.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. See, we've got one from Sim. How would you position your talk on graduate attributes? Okay, yeah. I think a lot of graduate attributes are, what can I say, open to a lot of thought, that we have to turn our minds to those attributes. They're not neutral. They're open to more people, their development is open to more people potentially than others. So who is the person, who is the graduate who demonstrates these attributes? Remember, you're describing a person. So who is that person? And how are some people already groomed into becoming that person before they even hit first year, where others are a long way from becoming that person? But I think it's also necessary to think about certainly what the students said at Rhodes University during the protests. I was Deputy Vice Chancellor then, and I talked to a lot of students during the protests. And what the students said is, we don't want to be the people you want us to be. It's like, oh, what does that mean? Yeah, that has given me a lot of thought. I think some of the things that students were saying then was that they didn't want to just become these people. Their time at university was often constructed as about getting a good job. What they were saying was, we actually want to serve our country. And my experiences during the protests led me to put a lot more work into community engagement, service learning, and so on like that, and things like that. But it was also about, the imposition of a particular identity. How far is that identity white and middle class? Does it have to be like that? So I think, these things of attributes, you really have to think hard about them. I had a PhD student, Bernie Miller, who sadly died 2 years ago, and she wrote a brilliant PhD on attributes and showed how, very philosophical piece, attributes aren't what we think they are. They don't work like that. But I really think we have to turn and ask, who are we asking our students to be? Is that fair? Is that right? And even if we think it is right, because we imagine, for example, this engineering professional or this doctor or whoever, and they have to behave professionally, and so on and so on. It's going to take some people more to get there than others, and some people are going to have to let go more of their being to get there than others. Yeah.
Thank you, Chrissie. I see there's a question in the chat from Dr. Viljoen.
Okay, to what extent does the evidence student needs to present to validate their ways of knowing, okay, represent the oppression or enslavement that critical theory so rails against? Well, of course it does, but that's an extra step in the teaching, isn't it? And look, I'm better at the social sciences than the natural sciences, because that's who I am. But if you think about what we actually have to do, I've suggested talking about knowledge, claims, and evidence. But students need to understand that there are different positions in a knowledge field. They often can't see those positions in the knowledge field. And that it's possible to take up different positions in a knowledge field. I've got a brand new PhD student this year, and the first bit of feedback I gave to her is, you're not seeing positions in the literature. And she's a PhD. So could we build on that work of, first of all, saying, you're here to learn how to make knowledge. Okay, the university makes knowledge in particular ways. Ultimately, you can turn around to critique those ways of making knowledge, and we hope that you might be able to do that eventually. But you first of all got to engage with them. So if you talked about the knowledge claim and the evidence, could a next step then start to be, your evidence comes from different positions. Could you provide articles and overtly show them how they come from the different positions? Now, I think that's teaching academic literacy. And I think that's an academic teaching academic literacy. I'm very suspicious of academic literacy courses because they'll only teach the very generic stuff. But if you could take that step, I think that you could draw on that critical theory to show how the ways of knowing do or can represent oppression and enslavement, and offer the students a way to finding other ways of knowing, and so on. Now, I see we've got a hand. Someone's
Debbie,
got
please. Debbie, you're welcome. So I think that's the last question from Debbie. Thank you.
Okay. Chrissie, I think you hit my nail on the head in the middle of my stomach when you spoke about, engaging with students who are saying that the graduate attributes that we are trying to instill in them is not who they want to be. And to me, how do we deal with the tension between what is really a societal problem in the whole of the country and the boundaries of what we're trying to do in higher education? And what really also resonated with me is yesterday I was reading an article about empathy in South Africa and how people build empathy, and there's just so many societal problems that would influence the degree of empathy that people feel. And if you've come from this disenfranchised background where you have been oppressed, then your chances of feeling empathetic towards other people are decreased. So and this is South African society. These are the people who are coming into our university. So how do we deal with that tension?
I can only say that we have to talk. And at the moment, I think we're talking around the issues. We're not talking to the issues. So, look, one of the things I understand is that a lot of students come to university and they bring with them what Bernstein calls horizontal discourse. So that's ways of knowing based on experience and common sense. And okay, they're valid ways of knowing, but there are limitations to those ways of knowing in that they're very context dependent. And what the university does is it offers other ways of knowing which will allow a knower to move beyond an immediate context and make sense of the world beyond that context. So if we could we somewhere, somehow, and I actually think it's the academics who has to do this. I think people in academic development, academic support, whatever you call it, they could begin by opening up the conversation. But I think, a broad introduction to knowing in the university and knowing outside the university, and saying, look, this is how it is at the moment. There is some value to these ways of knowing in the university because they do differ to the ways of knowing outside the university. But what do you think? Could you just open that up to them and have that conversation? I think that would be something, because I personally believe that the theorized ways of knowing, the data-driven ways of knowing of the university are very valuable. I've written about this Boughey last year, 2022. But what we need to do is to open up the possibility of producing powerful ways of knowing that are indigenous. It's another session altogether, but at least to try to make students aware and say, this is the way it is at the moment. There is another way, but it's for you to do it. I can't do it. It's for you to do it. My friend Siseko Kamalo says it's a task of African scholars for at least the next decade. This is a job for you. I think that would be a way forward. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm muted, Nicoline. Nicoline, you are muted. Were you saying something?
No, I say I'm handing over to you. Thank you so much, Chrissie and colleagues.
Yes. Thank you so much, Prof, for being willing to come and present to the SU community. It was definitely a thought-provoking presentation. And yeah, I want to thank the rest of the colleagues for coming and engaging. I know you are already thinking about these issues as our Auxin attendees and people who usually, we talk to these issues, on Auxin. So I want us to perhaps, as Chrissie was saying, it's now in our hands, not to talk to the problem, but start looking at it and working and coming up with more solutions. So next week, and I mean, not next week, next Auxin, we are going to be looking at AI, focusing on ChatGPT, and how we can start looking at it in the context of teaching and learning. We will see you then, colleagues. Thank you so much. Chrissie, I'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, Chrissie.
Thank you,
Bye.
colleagues.
Thanks,
Bye.
Sim. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.